How will inflation affect my retirement? That's what I'm talking about this week. Stay tuned. I really wanted to get into this question of how will inflation affect my retirement, because inflation is probably one of the biggest factors in retirement. Leading up to retirement and being in retirement, inflation can really hinder how much you're going to spend or how much you need to have saved up before you get to retirement, with the forecast or the reality of inflation hitting your total bill when it comes time to start taking your monthly distributions. So how do we as the planners take into account inflation? Well, there's a couple different ways. The first way that we take into account inflation is we separate out your cost, right? So what we consider your essential living expenses, those are obviously going to be more closely tied towards the actual inflation number. So since inflation is running hot, something like 7%, that's a number that we're always looking at to ensure that is well within our assumptions for planning. And when we're assuming planning, we're assuming typically an age of retirement somewhere around early to mid 90s, depending on longevity, basically in your family. Now, the reason we plan that long, obviously, is so that you never run out of money, right? But inflation plays a really big key component to spending for obvious reasons. And right now, where we've accounted for inflation for your essential living expenses has been somewhere around 2.75%. So if we kind of take a step back and think about historically where inflation has been, it's run anywhere from 2 to 4%. More so recently, it's typically been 2 and sub 2% inflation. So we've had a lot of really nice years banked where inflation was relatively low and the investment returns have been relatively good. And so we've been in this really nice calm state. Well, before we came to the conclusion of where we have this inflation rate, we used to run a lot higher. Our inflation rate would be a lot higher. And so we've adjusted that down prior to these last couple of years because of the idea that the Fed mandate is somewhere around 2%. At least that's what they claim. And so we think we're still a little bit more conservative because we're estimating inflation to be a little bit higher than the Fed mandate. However, that's not the only factor. And so one of the big reasons that we account for inflation is through not only your essential living expenses, but through the other items such as healthcare. Right? Healthcare can turn out to be one of the biggest expenses in retirement. And JP Morgan puts out a great guide around retirement that helps aid us in our thinking when we talk about retirement planning. Now, this graph that I have here on the screen, and if you're listening, is a graph that shows changes in spending depending on your age. So it starts around age 45, and it says, hey, most people in the US have their peak spending somewhere in their early to mid 50s. This chart is showing somewhere around $114,000, and then it slowly declines downward all the way until you're age 80. Once you get to age 80, it slowly starts to increase. And the reason it does is around this healthcare number. Now, there are some differences between what we've projected for retirement for you versus what this chart is showing, but it really gives you this idea of where in retirement, or as you're getting closer to retirement, we can start to imagine and think through the big costs that are going to come out of your pocket. So we can't be static as we plan for your retirement to think that inflation is just going to be one piece of the pie. For example, we said all your spending is just going to increase every year at 2.5%. Then there you go, you're on your way and everything's honky-dory. Well, that's not true because inflation is going to affect different areas of your life. And so the big question, especially in this video, is how does it affect retirement? Well, it's going to affect it in different ways. We're going to account for inflation to hit not only your grocery budget, your update budget, your car spending, all that sort of things, but it's also going to affect your healthcare, right? And healthcare, as it stands today, is actually rising the fastest compared to any other spending category. And again, you can see that in this chart, right? Not only because it's increasing in spending, but it's showing that it's also increased as a portion of your budget. It just becomes the biggest part of your budget outside of housing or food, or basically those two. So when you look at this next graph that's showing this one down here at the bottom, shows annual average inflation by spending category. They are showing a historical average from 1982 until 2020, and then they're showing the comparison along the lines of 2021. So what it's showing is that housing has historically inflated by about 2.8%. More so recently has been about 5%. Healthcare has averaged about 4.7. Healthcare for 2021 has averaged about 2.2. Food and beverage about 2.7. More so last year around 6. Transportation 2. Last year 21% increase. And so in this right side, they show, hey, the overall inflation typically has been 2.7. Hey, what do you know? That's kind of been our number that we've been working off of. And the overall inflation for last year is 7.1. So you see a drastic change in difference in that number. And so, yeah, at a certain point, if inflation stays at 7%, right, it's going to make it really hard for you to spend at a level that we're talking about, because we're not accounting for you to spend at 7.1%. Right? The idea is that things are going to get more expensive, but not at that rate. If they're rising so fast, then we basically need more savings, or we can't spend as much because we got to kind of keep that money sheltered aside for the future spending. But again, this is the idea that as we're planning, we're thinking about expenses broken out. So not everything's going to rise at the same time or at the same rates. However, we feel pretty strongly about your essential living expenses being somewhere in that 2.7 range, and the healthcare costs we typically account for at 5 to 5.5%. So we feel a little bit overly conservative, and we want to be that way so that we know we are being as harsh as we can in the plan, which we hope means greater success for you as you're gearing towards retirement or in retirement, because we've already accounted for a lot of these kind of bad scenarios where inflation is running extremely hot. And lastly, this graph is showing the rising healthcare costs in retirement. So the time you go into Medicare at age 65 all the way up through age 95. And it's showing as a monthly total spend, whether it's through, it includes some Medicare Part D along with the Part B premiums and some out-of-pocket costs, right? So it starts at your age 65, you're spending at about $500 a month. This again is just an average. And then they're saying, hey, it basically triples and goes to about $1,500 by the time you get to your age 95. Again, this idea that not only does healthcare spending rise faster than most other things, but it becomes a bigger piece of your budget, because as we age, right, we're going to the doctor more, we need more help medically, and so that becomes just a bigger portion of your budget. And so I guess the solace and the silver lining to all this has been from the previous graph that I showed, that healthcare costs have actually only risen about 2.5% over the last year, which is a lot lower than they typically rise. So, we're anticipating something like 5 to 5.5%. If they're only rising at 2, then that's going to be the biggest part of your portfolio for spending. Then it typically can be chalked up to a win. So we still feel really good about what we have planned out and what we're, again, doing in the background. And this is kind of a deeper dive into how we're planning, and maybe we don't draw this out so much in the meetings, but this idea that even though inflation we're feeling the heat of it now as we go to the gas pumps or to the grocery store, maybe we're not driving as much, or we're eating less meats or steaks or whatever have you to lower the costs there. we as the planners are still accounting for that inflation, whether it's before you retire so that you have enough saved up, or during retirement so that you're never going to run out of money. We're planning on different rates and different levels of inflation affecting your portfolio. And although 7% is harsh, and again, it doesn't feel good as the consumer, as the advisor, we've planned out these different scenarios. And if we see something change, meaning we see the 7% lasting for years on years to come, then there probably would need to be some adjustments in our assumptions. But for now, our assumptions are staying what they are because we've already been kind of over accounting for inflation and under counting some investment returns. And now the table and script has flipped to where inflation has gotten ahead of what we've anticipated. The investment returns probably not doing as well as we thought they'd do, right? But again, this is just a window for the last maybe 6 months. So we're not losing sleep over this. We hope you're not losing sleep over this. We believe this is just a temporary thing where inflation has gone so high that it should be able to come back down, especially based on what the Fed has come out and said and what they plan on doing. So we're, again, not making any changes, at least to the retirement plans, the financial plans that we've done for you. And it's always something that we're going to monitor. However, I want to at least give you some kind of a peek into the window so that you have this understanding that, yeah, okay, these guys are thinking about all of these things. Even though we're not expressing them maybe in the meeting, we've accounted for costs going up, obviously, and then a bigger piece of your budget in healthcare rising faster than basically everything else. So I hope this was helpful. Again, we don't see inflation lasting at 7% forever. Again, it's probably been a little over a year now, or coming up to about a year now, where inflation's been running hot. We think it'll eventually start to come back down. And I guess the big takeaway from all this is to know that we've already accounted for inflation. We're accounting for it in a couple different ways, making sure that it's not even across the board. And so although it is affecting you, we've already accounted for it. The biggest thing is to stay healthy and to make sure that you're taking care of yourself, right? Because healthcare turns out to be the biggest piece of your budget, and it's rising at the fastest rate. So what's the best way to mitigate the inflation costs? Well, that's taking care of your health, making sure you're staying healthy, getting your exercise, learning something new in retirement. And if you need help with any of that, you let us know because we got a ton of ideas. So I hope you found this video helpful. Give it a like, comment. If you had any questions, reach out to us, let us know. If you're listening to the podcast, make sure you're subscribed so that you get the new episodes every week. And as always, have a great weekend and take care.